Yay. Welcome, everybody. This is Advancing Mission Thrivability, our first Webversation. We're delighted to have you all with us today. This is our opportunity to, as the word Webversation says, another one of our TPF made-up words, to have a web-based conversation. So we'll be in Brady Bunch mode today. We'll have the opportunity for some interaction, some conversation. We hope you brought some questions or thoughts to share with us today, and we'll dive into those in just a moment or two. On behalf of the Patterson Foundation and No Margin, No Mission, would love to welcome you. I'm Mike Oxman, one of the managing partners and principals in No Margin, No Mission. And that guy named Larry Clark is my partner in crime at No Margin, No Mission. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome my colleagues at the Patterson Foundation, Josephine Eisenberg, say hello, for whom without her, we would not have all the coordination and logistics for this initiative. Connor LaGrange, fellow at the Patterson Foundation, and also Michael Zimmerman, fellow at the Patterson Foundation. I don't believe Michael Corley is with us. If he is, Michael, you'll wave. And of course, we wouldn't have a session without all of you to join us from your terrific nonprofits in our 4-county region. So welcome to all of you. Just a word about why we're here today. I believe all of you, or at least most of you, were at our first webinar a week ago for Advancing Mission Thrivability, where we introduced the concept of strategic decision-making through the lens of both mission and also economic components. And we also talked about cope, adapt, and innovate. And today we want to take the opportunity to let you ask some questions, share some thoughts. Hopefully you've had a chance to spend a little time thinking about that webinar and maybe even diving into the worksheets that were shared. Several of you have sent us questions in advance of our session today, so we'll take some time to address those. And I know there were a few questions that we didn't get to during the webinar last week, so we'll also get to those. Connor, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a couple of quick Zoom housekeeping rules, that would be great.
Of course. Thank you, Mike. Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you with us today on this fine Wednesday, at least fine here in Sarasota. I don't know about Chicago and Washington, where Mike and Larry are, but we're grateful to have you with us. Just to go over a couple of Zoom things once again. I know we've all been Zooming for quite some time, but sometimes a refresher is helpful. If you'd add your name as well as your organization name to your Zoom box so that our Brady Bunch, not only do we have to say, hey, you, but we can also know what organization you're from when you ask a question. Secondly, to asking questions, feel free to either raise your hand physically or use the raise hand feature that Zoom has. You can find that by activating your toolbar on Zoom. Sometimes the simple physical hand raise is a little bit easier to see on the screen and a little bit easier to do. As well, feel free to add your questions in the chat box. Josephine and I will be monitoring that and getting those to Mike and Larry. So feel free to type any questions as well. And, you know, when you raise your hand and if there's a pause, feel free to unmute yourself and just jump right in. We'd love to hear your voice and hear from you. So again, we're grateful that you're here. On behalf of the Patterson Foundation, we're excited that you would take this journey with us. And Mike Oxman, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Connor. And one other housekeeping item, very important. Josephine, I'm going to ask you to just take a Zoom photo of the crew. So again, if you don't mind just sharing your pearly whites with us so we can see your face and capture you in our Zoom photo, that would be great. And of course, if you're not in a position to do that, that's fine too. Josephine, I'll turn it over to you to capture the photos.
Good morning, everybody. Just going to take 2 quick photos. Give me a second to set up. I'll let you know before I take it and ask you to smile and hold. Then I'll take one more because I've realized if I don't take two, the one I take somehow ends up not turning out. So I take both. All right, here we go. If you aren't on camera, please turn on your video if you so desire to. And then here we go, smile. And then one more time, give me a second. Okay, smile again. All right, thank you so much. And thanks for being here.
All right, thanks, Josephine. So the way we'd like to go through the moderated Q&A today is to share questions and responses in a few different categories. So the categories that we have fall into 6 different areas. And we're going to start with cope, adapt, and innovate. Again, remember the lens that we talked about during last week's webinar as a way for you to think about that continuum that all of us have been living through over the past several months, and perhaps how you and your teams made decisions throughout that process. So let's start with cope, adapt, innovate. And I guess we'll ask, is there anybody that has a burning question about cope, adapt, innovate that you would like to share and that Larry or I, or perhaps some others could respond to? Anybody have a question, a thought, a comment? So Laurel, I see you raised your hand first, I believe. So yes, you can just jump in and ask your question.
We were meeting and talking about last week's webinar. And when we were talking about adapt and innovate, some of the adaptations were innovations. And specifically, what is the difference between adapting and innovating?
Great question. So I'll start, and then Larry or others can jump in. The way that we typically will define the two, and you're right, I mean, there can be a little overlap, it can be a little fuzzy, is adapting is typically making tweaks and adjustments to something that you're already doing. So it tends to be a bit more subtle in terms of the actual change you're making. Whereas innovate, at least the way we like to think about it, may be a reinvention. It may be something completely new or different. But again, it is typically a reaction to something that has happened. So I don't know if that helps you or not, but again, one is more a tweak and adjustment, and the other is something that is a bit more significant in terms of its difference.
Yes, thank you.
Larry, anything to add on that?
I don't think so, Mike, other than, you know, there's more of a line between coping and adapting than adapting and innovating. So it gets a little blurry the farther down the continuum you get. So
good question, though. Anybody else have a question related to cope, adapt, innovate? Rebecca, you're on mute. There you go.
Yeah, there I am. Actually, I'm Melissa in place of Rebecca.
Melissa, who are you with? Which organization?
Sarasota Manatee Association for Writing Therapy, otherwise known as SMART. And one of the things that I think we've struggled with in answering these questions is that we think we've reached the adapt stage when something else happens. For instance, we depend on horses to deliver our product, and our horses get sick and can't be used in the program, so we have to recancel the program and start back all over again. So last week, I think I raised we feel like we've been through whack-a-mole for the past 2 years, because every time we think we have a solution, something external, well, not external to us, but something that happens on the farm with our animals or with our participants makes us stop go back to the beginning and restart again. So we've been up and down. Is that common during periods like this?
Mike, maybe I'll take this.
Yeah.
Actually, that was the first question that we were going to address. And first of all, we had to look up what whack-a-mole actually meant, because we had a little different interpretation of it. But we believe that you all at some time in your organization are playing whack-a-mole, where you have a lot of issues going on and things change so rapidly. And you have to, it's kind of like all the balls are up in the air and you're catching the one that's about to hit the ground, and they keep, rotating back and forth. So you're not alone, is what I'm trying to say. So I guess different organizations handle it differently, depending on what the issue is, what the crisis might be, what the question might be, what the event might be. And I guess we like to think about it as, how do you prioritize them? How do you kind of decide which is most important and least important? And we like to put it in some kind of a framework. So if you think about having a decision-making framework, which we're trying to talk about, which we're hopefully educating you around, is, part of that framework is maybe you have a strategic plan in place first, which helps set the direction of the organization, very high level, 15,000 feet. And maybe the next one is you have mission goals and revenue goals. So if you have those three things in place, it might help you make decisions a little bit easier. At least it helps frame them a little bit better. So as you're dealing with a crisis or you're dealing with something, you can decide, is this really important for us to decide today, or is it not? And obviously, if the horses are sick and you can't deliver the services, that's a huge issue, right? It's not just something that you can push aside. So you have to deal with that directly. But there might be other issues that aren't as important that you're able to kind of frame or put your arms around in a little bit of a different way of how does it fit in our strategic direction? How does it fit in our mission or in our margin? So, kind of a convoluted answer, I guess, to the question, but whack-a-mole is a bit different depending on where you're sitting and what the issue might be. So I don't know. Did I help answer some of that question for you?
Yes, I just sort of felt like we were all alone out here.
No.
It's been happening probably every 3 months, something external, as I call it, but we thought we had it under control and something happens and it's no longer under control.
Yeah, and part of that is thinking about the plan B scenarios. So if it's happened a few times, what have you learned? How will you handle it differently in the future?
Yeah.
So it might be, if the animals get sick, what do we do? You pull the trigger to start X, Y, and Z, whatever that course of action might be. So, it's happened to Mike and I a lot. We're doing sessions and all of a sudden one of us loses internet. I mean, yeah, we can't control that, but we have a plan B in place just in case. Hopefully it doesn't happen today. So, yeah.
One of the things too that you can think about, and I don't know if you've done this in the past, is are there any organizations locally that have horses as part of their mission that potentially you could have a backup plan or a partnership with, so that if something happens to your horses, that you might be able to, tap into their horses, as a backup. So, I think it's just, maybe you've done that. Maybe you have relationships already with some of those organizations. And if you do, they can help you out of a bit of a crisis like the one you shared. Right. And that applies to any type of organizations, not just a horse or an equine therapy type organization.
Right. Thank you. That's helpful.
Sure. I think Mirta has a question, right?
Yeah.
Morning, guys.
Morning.
Mike, that pronunciation, thank you. I typically get pretty butchered, but you were spot on with my name. Thank you, sir. And then what you just said is a perfect segue to what I was going to ask, and it's innovation through partnerships. How do we create? Is there a criteria for building partnerships to help grow our good?
Great question. So first of all, Nirda, we love partnerships. We do find that in the nonprofit sector, frequently partnerships are, they become kind of that bad P word. But the reality is that we hope that organizations, executive directors, CEOs, board members, and staff members will take the time to think about good strategic partnerships. Who are the likely candidates that you should approach, that you should think about innovating with to deliver either new programs, products, services, or offerings, or ones that you can evolve and take to the next level because a partner can help you do it better, faster, stronger, or whatever that might be. So I think, one thing that Larry and I always suggest is that take the opportunity to brainstorm sort of some strategic partnerships that might be on your wish list. And frequently, again, we just find that nonprofits don't take the time to do that. So in that sphere of innovation, when you open your minds to thinking about who are some good strategic partners that if we could wave our magic wand, we would look to partner with, write those down, think about, and brainstorm what a partnership might be, and even take it to Larry and I are very big on writing a one-page concept paper, just one page. What is it? Kind of the who, what, when, where, why, how, and think through each of those pieces. And once you've thought it through, set up a meeting with that partner organization, with that executive director or CEO, and say, we've got an idea and we'd love to sit down and share it with you. So that's just a kind of a quick thought starter idea. Larry, anything to add to that?
Yeah, prior to the meeting, it might be a good idea once you have the concept paper done to actually do a SWOT analysis against the partnership. So what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of having that organization as a partner? And focus on the weaknesses and the threats, and can we mitigate those in our conversation? So that might help you decide, do we set up a meeting or not? And if we do, there's a couple of weaknesses here in this partnership. How would we structure the partnership in such a way so it's beneficial to us and to them? So that's it.
It's a great question, Nirda. Hopefully that answers it, or at least helps to start to answer it. But again, you just have to start somewhere. So the whole idea of thinking about what is the partnership idea and fleshing it out a bit, and then taking it, ultimately to whoever that partner might be to start to discuss it. So does that answer your question?
Thank you. It's a great place to start. Good. And I'll be back with more.
All right, good. Let's see, Barbara.
I also thought that was a great question. Thank you. But I was really surprised when you said that partnerships, that like the letter P, indicating that some people don't like them. So what is the thinking behind not liking partnerships?
Well, it's not so much the thinking, it's more the reality. Larry and I have worked with so many nonprofits in so many places that we've just learned over time that oftentimes there's just resistance to partnerships in the nonprofit sector. If this group doesn't experience that or hasn't experienced that, that's a great thing. But oftentimes nonprofits feel that they're competing with other nonprofits for funding, for grants, for, ultimately, the dollars and cents, because there's only so many dollars to go around, that there's been a mindset that has perpetuated itself around, if we partner with somebody, we might be sharing, our hand with them, which in turn could lead to them being, a competitor for funding. So again, it's just an observation maybe that we've had over time. but we're not advocates, for that behavior at all. We love partnerships, especially when they make sense and they can help strengthen organizations, and move them forward.
I just wanted to add to that. What I just said a minute ago about a SWOT analysis, Barbara, is there's a lot of strengths in partnerships, but there's a lot of weaknesses too. So just go into it with your eyes wide open as far as all the downside to the partnerships, and can you right side that going into the partnership, whether there's a written agreement or something that you have in place. Because usually if the partnership falls apart, it's because something happened. And how can you alleviate that in the very beginning by thinking through it on how would I approach that if that happened? So just as you're approaching it from a very positive way, great partnership, we're going to both benefit mission-wise and maybe financially, what could go wrong and how would we handle that? What's our plan B? So, yeah. Mike, maybe we should go on to the next question.
Good. All right. So that was Cope, Adapt, Innovate. The next category we want to talk about is mission focus. So again, this idea of mission-centric decision-making that we shared during the first webinar is important. And we'll start this one by asking the group, does anybody have a burning question or thought or comment that you'd like to share? And if not, we do have a few questions that you had sent us prior to the session today. So again, mission focus, mission-centric decision-making. Anybody have a question to share? If not, I'm going to start with the first one that we received. Somebody asked us, do you have a rubric that organizations could use to differentiate the mission from the economic component and how to dive deep into that thinking? So that's a great question. And it's one that we're actually going to address during webinar number 2 next week. So the answer is yes, we do have what we call a mission and economic matrix, where you can, as an organization, plot your programs, your products and services along both of those axes and get a sense for which of your products, programs, and services are yielding the greatest impact in both of those areas, which ones might be yielding the least amount, and then which ones may fall somewhere in between that you may be able to dial up on one or both of those axes. So not going to say a lot more about that other than tune in, make sure you join us for next Wednesday's webinar, because we will talk about that and we'll share sort of the tool and the thinking around that. Josephine and Connor, just you're monitoring the chat box. Any questions at this point under
Nope.
Mission focus, mission centric decision making? Okay, here's another question that somebody asked. The question was, if how we operate has changed over the past year and a half and during the pandemic, but we want to bring back programs as we're able to come together again, do we change our mission statement or just our goals? So that's a good question, because when organizations, and many of you have done this, have had to make changes and pivots and just sort of rethink things, it's a natural question to say, how does that impact on our goals? And is what we're doing still mission aligned? So I guess our response to that is, first, generally it's unlikely that your mission or your mission statement would change as a result of what you've been through, unless there was an extraordinary circumstance that necessitated such a change. So if something happened during the pandemic that for some reason just made your mission no longer relevant, then I guess, you know, as a leadership board and staff, you'd have to sit down and figure out, all right, so, you know, do we need to change our mission? Unlikely, but possible. Second, and probably more importantly, is that, you know, it may be necessary to change your goals, depending on whether they're still realistic and attainable, given the current circumstances that you're in and the realities of the marketplace. So case in point is, if your organization had goals that you had set for the year in 2020 or even in 2021, given all the circumstances around the pandemic, many of your organizations likely couldn't achieve those goals for one reason or another. So hopefully you were able to revisit those goals, to make some shifts and refinements and changes to them, to adjust them based on, you know, the realities of the marketplace. And I think to that point, third, you know, remember that goals and goal setting can be fluid and flexible, you know, especially considering the world we're living in. So I guess a question for this group is, how many of you, and maybe you can just show of hands, how many of you within your organizations actually changed your organizational goals in some way, shape, or form in 2020 and or 2021? Just a show of hands, you know, raise your hand or type in the chat box. No. And that's, you know, it's important to recognize that that's okay. Just because you have goals and a plan, or you have a plan, doesn't mean that it can't shift or change. So again, it's kind of an important consideration, and one to remember, that all your goals should be living, breathing goals, and ones that you look at, think about, and that your team is always considering, you know, day to day, week to week, month to month. So Larry, anything to add on that one?
No, I think you covered it, Mike.
Okay. Larry, do you want to go to the next question?
Sure. The next question was still around mission statement. What do you feel is an effective length for a mission statement? We often feel that ours may be too wordy. So just a show of hands, how many think your mission statement is a bit too wordy right now? A couple of you. All right. So we encourage organizations to develop short, concise statements without jargon or buzzwords or acronyms. So one of our organizations that we worked with, or that we continue to work with in the greater Sarasota area, is the Florida Cultural Group. So their mission statement, as an example, is the mission of the Florida Cultural Group is to create, entertain, and strengthen an artistic, thriving, curious, and creative community by bringing people together. So it's very short, one sentence, very concise. So we would suggest, if you're concerned about your mission statement, that you really do take a step back and challenge your team to think about, how do you shorten it a bit? I mean, I've seen mission statements that are 3 paragraphs long, and there's no way somebody could remember all of that. So how do you think about it in 2 different ways? Could we do our mission statement at 10 words or less, or 1 or 2 sentences without run-ons? So think about it that way. At some point in time, if you revisit your mission statement, how can you shorten it, make it much more concise? And then test it on your team. I know when I took over an organization a number of years ago, I brought my staff in, and we had 70 full-time staff and my board, and I said, what's our mission statement? I got 70 different answers. No one could state it quite clearly. And I thought, wow, if we're confused about our mission statement, think about the message we're delivering to the community. So just make sure it's concise, that everyone's participating with your organization, whether they staff or volunteers or board, they understand it, they can repeat it, and they know what it means. So that's, any questions or thoughts about that, about mission statements?
I'm not sure, Jonathan, you have your hand up. Do you still have a question?
Yeah, hi. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for hosting this morning. So just a bit of context to my question. It's sort of linked to that, Larry, but it's the relationship between mission and impact goals. And also, I've done a lot of, well, a reasonable amount of strategic planning in other contexts, and often there's a every strategic planning has different wordings used for outcomes or objectives or goals or impacts or whatever it might be. I was just interested in the thought process behind going straight from a mission statement to impact goals, because conceptually, I tend to think about there being a step for me, which is what outcomes am I trying to achieve? What changes am I trying to achieve in the community? And then my goals being, how do I know that I've achieved those outcomes? Specifically because having a concise mission statement doesn't always capture everything about the change that you're trying to create in the organization. So my question was, I tend to find that usually, or almost always, there is a reason why a framework has been created in a certain way. So I was just curious about that, because I tend to find, regardless of whether you say objectives or goals or results, which I know is an interesting word in this area, sometimes results is fun. They might mean some similar things, but there's usually a reason why a framework has a certain structure to it. So I was interested in that, why there's the jump straight from mission to an impact goal, which is really your kind of what you're doing. Yeah.
You know, I don't think we disagree with you. I think you just have to approach it what feels best for you. As I read the mission statement for the Florida Cultural Group, there's some framework there. There's some approach to how they do their work. You know, you start with the vision statement first. You don't even start with a mission statement. It's like, what vision do we want in the community to take place because we exist? The mission is, what's our role in that? And then it gets down to, just as you said, how do we make that role kind of play out in the community? How do we measure it? What's the best way to do it? And we're saying, take a look at your mission and your margin, or both of those, as you're trying to make those decisions of what's our role in that. Because there's a lot of other organizations that have a role in whatever that vision is. We're just a small piece of that. So we agree with you that it's a stepped process, you know, with the bottom line being, what did we accomplish and how is it going to help us make difference in our decision-making going into the next calendar year or budget year? Or do we need to take a step back and say, do we need a bit of a different role in making a difference in our community because of that?
Sure.
So, yeah.
Sure. And I agree. And I think, you know, I used to work in a very, very large organization. And so sometimes you need that extra step to make that, because you might be doing a lot of things. For a smaller organization, it maybe made more sense to have your mission and then the direct impact you're trying to achieve, and keeping it simple for smaller organizations. So I totally get it. And I like the focus on what are we doing, what is actually happening, getting down to that kind of practical side, because often it can be easy to kind of stick with, well, we're kind of doing the right thing and in the right space and it feels good, but actually what's the impact? So I appreciate that. Thank you.
We find the larger organizations, the much larger organizations, get bogged down in bureaucracy and the whole process. So maybe you dealt with that just a bit, but anyway, take a step back and just ask your board members and your staff members or your volunteers, what's our mission statement, and see what their response is. I think it might surprise you along the way. Hopefully they could repeat it. I'm venturing to say you'll get a bit of a different response depending on who you ask. All right, Mike, do you want to move on?
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. And Jonathan, I think you raise a good point. One thing that Larry and I always encourage organizations to do, and it is particularly important as you think about mission related to products, programs, and services. And that is, as you're really dissecting, analyzing, looking at each of those programs, products, services that your organization has, truly trying to understand how does each one contribute to helping create impact that's aligned with your mission. And particularly in, when times are challenging, but even when they're not, really knowing and being able to prioritize how those programs, products, and services that you have in your organization, whether you're a large organization, a small organization, or somewhere in between, how they're delivering and what type of mission impact they're delivering. Because again, remember, sometimes organizations are doing things, not because they should be doing them, but because they've been doing them for a long time, or somebody, a board member, somebody had an idea, we should be doing this. And the reality is, how are you looking at and understanding the impact that they're having? And are you keeping them around for the sake of having them around? Or are you looking at them to say, is it working? Great, let's figure out ways to keep them and make them work harder. They're not working, maybe we need to set them aside, and move on. So again, it's just, it's part of that process to both understand, think about, analyze, and then take action on those things that you have within your organization.
And next week, as Mike said, we'll dive into the matrix, which will help you kind of think through it a bit more. Should we move on to communication, Mike?
Yes. So communications is the next category. I'm going to just share this first question because we actually had two people ask the same question. And that is, how do we strengthen our board and their desire to serve? Or stated another way, how do we motivate our board to move from inaction to action? And we actually hear this question a lot from the organizations that we work with. And it's an important one. So I think that we'll preface it by saying that in the case of boards being, board members being active or not, and serving in ways that you would hope they would, we believe it's important to start just by recognizing who on your board, who specifically on your board is strong and serving and who is not. So you likely have a pretty good understanding for that, but if you don't, that's a good starting point. The second part of that then is to remember and just acknowledge kind of the 20-80 rule. And that just, sort of applies in lots of different places. So more often than not, 20% of your board or board members will do 80% of the work. That's just kind of typically the way it works. Not always, but generally speaking. So recognizing that, we do believe that there's a number of ways that you can be intentional about at least getting your board to take a more active role. So a few things just to take note of here. So be intentional about setting clear expectations for board members prior to joining. So do you as an organization have sort of the checklist of what the expectations are for each of your board members, both in terms of potentially fundraising, board governance, and or other expectations. If you don't have those, it's a good thing to do. And if you do have them, that's great, because then there's no misunderstanding by board members who are coming into your organization. Secondly, be intentional about onboarding your board members. So as a new board member comes into your organization, what kind of education and training would help to give them a better understanding about your organization? Should they have a day in the field, excuse me, with your clients or those you serve? Should they shadow some folks in your agency to really get an understanding and a firsthand look at how things work and the why behind them? So board education and training is always an important component here. Another thing that we encourage you to be intentional about is to be very strategic in your board recruitment process. So as an organization, who's on your board, what skill sets do they have, and what do they do that really helps to propel and drive the organization forward? Similarly, who's not on your board that has a skill set that you as an organization could use that could help propel you forward? So you may have somebody who's a communications or a marketing expert. You may have an attorney on your board. Maybe you don't have, a local business leader. Maybe you don't have an accountant. Maybe you don't have, and the list goes on. So really being intentional about thinking about, you know, what do you have, but what do you need? And looking to recruit board members to fit those sort of the gaps that you might have. We also, again, you know, we're big believers in setting goals. So it's okay to actually set some goals for your board. You know, what are some things that you would like your board, both individually and collectively, to accomplish on an annual basis? If you've never thought about those, it's a good exercise to go through. Another piece that we always suggest you be intentional about is to establish and enforce term limits for your board members. So oftentimes organizations will say, well, yeah, we have we have term limits for our board members, but you know, our board members, even though they get through their term, can come back and serve a second term or a third term. Well, sometimes that's okay and great, and other times it's not, because it can lead to board burnout. It can lead to you know, board members not being as active contributors as you might like. And I think the last piece of this is be intentional about communicating with your board. And you'll hear us say this a lot too: communicate, communicate, communicate. So share with your board members, give them updates, let them know what's happening, and make sure that, you know, there's a sense of, about all those components within your organization for which they may have interest, but also will help lead to a better understanding of their role and why they're a part of that. So that was the first question, and I'll just pause for a second. Does anybody have any questions related to that? Karen, did you raise your hand?
I did raise my hand.
Yes.
I don't know if you're going to touch on this, but I'll just jump in with a question.
Sure.
How do you have ideas or on recruitment, or I mean, we also have a couple of board members who not only during the pandemic, but because they have personal issues and things, and they're just not working. I mean, they may be efficient in one area. We're a theater group, and they may enjoy their time on stage and working with us that way, but they're not taking care of any business as far as being a board member goes. And we have not dismissed anybody from the board. I really, you know, I prefer not to do that. But I guess ideas on how to recruit people, such as the aforementioned people with skill sets like attorneys and accountants, or
yes,
who might want not to necessarily be involved creatively, but are willing to culturally, you know, support what we're doing.
Great question. So just a couple of thoughts on that. One is, remember, you know, we said be intentional about setting clear expectations for your board members before they come on board, and don't be upset if you have to ask them to step down from the board. I mean, the reality is, if a board member is just there and they're dead weight for whatever reason, of course you can be, you know, you can do it in a way that's very tactful, but the reality is, you shouldn't be afraid to ask a board member to step down if they're not meeting their board obligations. So again, Larry and I are just big believers that don't just hug people and keep them around for the sake of doing that, because it doesn't really help you propel your mission as an organization and move it forward. The other part of your question is recruiting, and there's lots of different ways to recruit board members outside of the sphere of your comfort zone. I mean, you know, your comfort zone is obviously folks who are part of kind of the your theatrical community, and that's okay. But encourage each of your current board members and other folks who you know to network, to suggest people outside of that sphere of what's comfortable. And to really look at others who can help your organization be stronger and better. So, you know, you really have to push yourself out of your comfort zone to recruit board members. And I think the other thing is we've worked with many organizations who, when they're looking for others in other sectors, communicate, you know, send out notices, send out bulletins, you know, get people, build some visibility and awareness around kind of what you're looking for. And you'll actually probably be pleasantly surprised that whether it's an attorney, an accountant, somebody's in the marketing field, will have a natural interest in your organization because they like the work that you do, and you know, likely will raise their hand to say, I'm interested. So just, you know, I think it's a matter of it comes back to communicate, I guess.
Thank you.
Karen,
Sure.
I just have one comment. I found when I was the executive director of a foundation, the best thing for me to do is to have a one-on-one conversation with them. If you're concerned about their behavior, it's sitting down with them and having a personal conversation about it and how you're feeling about their lack of interest or their lack of engagement, and see what their response is. I mean, they might say, you know what, you're right, it's time for me to leave. I mean, they might come to that conclusion themselves, but I think that one-on-one conversation is really important. And I think, as you know, if you're dealing with theater people, they're used to being, you know, out there and having conversations, right? They shouldn't have a problem with you approaching them. So I think one-on-one is sometimes a good first move. So, Mike, we have about 10 minutes left.
Let's move to capacity building.
Okay.
So the next category, Larry's going to share a question that we got from somebody about sort of this idea of, you know, building capacity, and in particular as relates to the subject at hand, which is, you know, mission-centric decision making. So Larry, do you want to share the first question?
So the question is, can you suggest a format or platform to track goals? So, I mean, there's a lot of ways to do that, but first and foremost is you have to make sure that you have them and that they're measurable. So I won't do a show of hands because some of you might not be able to raise your hand, but do you have measurable goals for every single program, projects, or service that you're delivering out there? And measurable meaning time specific and attainable. So it could be a mission related goal along with the time associated with that, might be a financial goal with a time associated with that, but make sure they're attainable as you're setting them. Don't set something that's so far reaching that you know you're never going to do it and it's like more of a stretch goal. Think about these as attainable. So first of all, you have to have those in place, and then be diligent about monitoring and tracking the progress on those. So for example, you know, if you're serving people or animals, how many did you serve? How much did it cost to serve them? Over what period of time did you serve them? So even if you think about it in just those three areas, as you're thinking about your budget for next year or goal setting for next year, think about just how many you're doing, how much is it costing to do that, and what period of time are you going to deliver in? And so then it's really important to take that step back and say, now that we set those goals, how do we measure them? So it's going in and looking at how many people did we, how much did it cost, did we meet our goal as far as the time frame? And you can track that a lot of different ways. You could put an Excel spreadsheet together. There's online platforms that you could probably find. Some of them are crazy complicated, others are very simple. However you choose to do it, just do it. It might be easiest to start with an Excel spreadsheet and just, you know, do it that way, and make sure that everyone on your staff and your board is educated that these are the measurement tools we're going to be using, and this is how we're going to track and monitor them. So everyone's kind of aware of that as they move forward. And I can almost guarantee you, and Mike and I find this, that if you have set those goals in place and you have the measurements in place and they know they're going to be tracked, there's a motivation there to make sure that we accomplish those. So I don't know, that's just a thought, some thought. Any of you track and monitor your goals in a way that you'd like to share? Yeah, go ahead, Melissa.
Yeah, probably prompted by the fact that Manatee County requires it of us. We have measures after each session with a child or young adult who comes from Manatee County on their achievement of, say, 4 specific objectives to that individual, based on their performance the day that they're riding.
Right.
So we've started doing that for all of our participants.
Oh,
the only thing we haven't done is to extend that to where we have groups, like if we have a veterans group come in, or if we have a bunch of people with that are cancer survivors, and we still have to get ourselves to that point. But as I said, only because Manatee County required it did we develop that.
Yeah.
And we are required in order to get their monthly grant to report to them on what we've done.
Right. So
it's the wrong reason, but
you raise a really good point that as an organization, we have to set our goals and track and monitor them, but we might have a grant or an external organization that's expecting us to do that. So, it kind of goes both ways. Yeah. Good. Thank you for sharing that. Mike, should we move
on? I have a somewhat similar scenario in that it was sort of self-imposed, however. We run meetings with support group meetings for guys that have prostate health issues. And what I have found is that people would constantly ask, well, how many people did you serve? How many people attended this meeting? What were the issues and so on? And so what I've done is a very rudimentary kind of procedure, but I have a 1-page paper that simply records every single meeting, the date, the time, the cost of that meeting. And for example, if we provided food or whatever else, how many dollars were spent on it, and then what was the reaction of the people that attended. First of all, how many attended, and secondly, how many people responded with positive response or negative response and commentary. So it's a very useful tool. And I just started doing it about probably a year ago, because part of the issue we have, of course, is raising money, and foundations or whoever is supporting you with financial support wants to know what you're actually accomplishing. So it was kind of self-imposed, but at the same time, it did come from an outside source. But it's been very useful, really very useful.
David.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing, David. I think that, even taking it up a level, saying we want to serve 5,000 men in our classes, and then take it down to what are we achieving in our classes and how many people are actually attending. So, Good. Mike, let's move on.
I think Barbara from Project 180 has a question. Barbara.
Just going to mention another way to track data, and that is through pivot tables. I don't know if anybody else is familiar with them, but we're just now converting all of our information to pivot tables. We're a prisoner reentry program, so we track a lot of information, and pivot tables are extremely useful for being able to recall data and get reports pretty much immediately.
That's great. Right. Another thing too that a lot of organizations that we work with either do or have started to do, remember that you can use data, that is, quantitative. You can also use qualitative and anecdotal information, but the key is to capture it. Observations. I think David, as you suggested, use SurveyMonkey. If you're not using SurveyMonkey, it's a great tool. It doesn't cost you anything. You can follow up with people and get impressions. Just as we did after our first webinar last week, we sent out a SurveyMonkey and we got your feedback. So it helped us to understand, a number of sort of components that we believed were important coming out of that session. So lots of different ways to do it. We're going to take, let's see, well, there's one more area that we want to jump into and cover before we wrap. And that's in the area of best practices. So we had a question from somebody, and the question was, can you share best practices for embracing change in an organization? That's an interesting question, embracing change. So, and it is relevant to our conversations about strategic decision-making, also considering what we all lived through over the past several months. And as we moved through cope, adapt, and innovate, lots of change happening at sort of a very rapid pace. So we have just a few thoughts on that. One is, as an organization is going through change and hoping to have its team embrace it, one is, to really step back and make sure you as a team, a leadership team, board, understand what's the situation and identify what you're trying to accomplish, and just to be very intentional about that. Also, to recognize that change isn't easy, that it may take longer for some to embrace change than others. And for those who can't accept change after a certain period of time, they may need to move on. Again, in the nonprofit sector, we tend to, embrace and hug our team members, regardless of the situation. And sometimes that's just not the best for them, for the organization, for the mission. So again, recognizing that that change is possible for folks, but it may not be possible for some as well. The next thing that we, again, you hear us say this ad nauseum, is communication. So we do believe that communication is key, especially in situations within organizations where change is happening. So making sure that your communication is forthcoming, is honest, is transparent, and brings people along so that they're all at kind of an equal point in understanding. Just because you know it as the leader or the board member in an organization doesn't necessarily mean that everybody else does. Another piece that we believe is important is entrepreneurial spirit. When you live in a world where change is ongoing, remember that staying flexible and fluid is important. Looking for opportunities and possibilities is important. Innovation is important. Trying new things and making course corrections as you go. And also, if you're an organization that's been accustomed to perfection, it's probably a good thing to ease up on that. You're not looking for perfection. Oftentimes, when change is happening, you're looking for excellence. So that's something to keep in mind. And of course, as Larry and I will always say, keep your mission front and center, at the forefront of kind of all those things that might be happening as people are looking to embrace change. Involve your team in discussion, in possibilities, in decision-making, and in outcomes. And probably last but not least, stay positive and keep an open mind. So again, those are kind of our thoughts on how to help folks embrace change. And with that, I think we'll stop. Larry?
Yeah, Mike, I was just going to say one little tool that you might use is, and I used to do this on Fridays, I would take 15 minutes and just do a short note to all my board and all my staff and to some volunteers that said, this is what happened this week, and this is what we can look forward for next week. It was just really clear what was happening inside the organization. So there was no interesting questions at board meetings. They got my note every Friday. They know what's happening, and they would call me and get a bit more engaged because of that. So again, think about ways to communicate.
Well, we've used up our 60 minutes. Time flies when you're having fun. As we wrap, Larry, do you want to just share what's next?
Sure.
Then we can say goodbye.
So tomorrow, you will get an email from Josephine with the registration for next week's webinar. It is on Wednesday. It is at 10 o'clock. And we truly hope you show up. And also 1 or 2 or 3 of your team members will also register. The more people you have engaged in your agency in the discussion, the more conversation you can have internally. So you'll get the registration tomorrow. Please register and try to bring a board member or 2. And if you have staff members or other volunteers, that would be great. That's it.
All right. Well, unless anybody has any parting comments, questions, or thoughts, we're going to say goodbye. So thanks everybody for joining us. and we'll see you next Wednesday, same time.
All right.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.